All right, Pouring Nation, today I want to clear up a bunch of questions that you guys have had about acrylic paint pouring terminology. Now, if we don't use the same terminology, when you ask me a question and I understand it differently than you do, we're going to cross wires and it's not going to make sense to either you or to me. So what I want to do is go through some of the most misunderstood or the questions that I get the most about acrylic pouring terminology to hopefully help keep that from happening and get you learning how to pour and get great results faster. So the first term that I want to talk about is pouring medium. Now the whole idea of acrylic paint pouring is taking thick acrylic paint and turning it in to a pouring mixture that can be poured. So to do that, we use a pouring medium. So the first kind of pouring medium we have are the traditional pouring medium or professional pouring mediums. These are specifically created with acrylic binders and different binders to thin out paint without diluting them. And each one has its own instructions on how much you mix with your paint, but these are the professional pouring mediums. The second type are the budget pouring mediums, which aren't traditional pouring mediums, but they're liquids that will work as a pouring medium because of how they're built. Flood Floetrol, Owatrol in Canada and the United Kingdom. These are paint additives generally used for latex paint that you can add to help the paint flow better and to prevent brush marks. Glue, which also with a little bit of water will turn into a medium, which allows for you to spread out how much paint you use in your pour and give you a nice consistency. And there's lots of different kinds of glue. We have Glue All here and Craftsmart glue. So these are more budget. They're generally quite a bit cheaper and replacement pouring mediums. So the next term is craft paint, student acrylic, and professional acrylic. Now I have all three here. Craft paint is generally bought at a craft store, at a department store, a dollar store, Craftsmart, Folk Art, Americana. Sometimes they come in bigger ones. These are paints that are really supposed to be used in crafts. They don't have very high pigmentation. They're already a little bit fluid, and they're generally on the cheaper end. Now there are some of the metallics and like color shift paints, the high sheen, that are a little bit more higher quality and they're more expensive. But these would be considered craft paints. And craft paints you can't dilute as much just because they don't have as much pigmentation. They're not going to last as long in direct sunlight, but they are cheaper. Then we have our student level acrylics, which is the Master's Touch, the Liquitex Basics, Blick, Artist Loft. These are going to be soft and medium body acrylics. And then there are the more professional. In this case, I have the Artist Loft Student, or the Artist 2 and the Artist 3. This is a medium body or a medium viscosity paint. This is a high viscosity, which would be a heavy body paint. They generally have about the same pigmentation, but this one's going to be thicker. These are definitely more expensive, but they are definitely a little bit higher quality than the student level acrylic and much higher quality than the craft paint. There are also fluid acrylic paints, which are very fluid paints. They're also very expensive because of that, but they're highly pigmented and generally are considered some of the better paints of the different paint types. Generally, for me, I use student level acrylics. It's the best bang for the buck. It's not as expensive as these, and the color goes a lot longer than the craft paint. So again, craft paint, student level acrylics, and professional acrylics with the medium and heavy body, and then the fluid acrylic. So the next thing is pigments. Pigments I divide into two different categories. The first category is the traditional sense of a pigment is ground up color, and that powder is used to create colors. Pigment powder in a suspended liquid like an acrylic emulsion makes acrylic paint. So when you're talking about pigments, you really are talking about the powder color, and the traits of the pigment. Pigments can be heavy, they can be light fast, which means the sunlight will not cause them to fade. They can be not very light fast. I'm sure you've all seen a bumper sticker that has faded over time. That's color that's not light fast. So those are pigments that are not light fast. The second part of pigments are something like this, which is a pigment, a mica powder pigment, where you can actually take this powder, put it into your acrylic pouring medium, whether it's be one of those or one of these, and make your own acrylic paint, essentially. Now, these powders have regular pigment plus mica powder, which makes them shiny. Mica is a rock that they grind up to make it shiny and sparkly. So sometimes people will talk about pigments meaning just the color. Sometimes they'll talk about pigments meaning something like this that has mica powder that when mixed with other colors and with a medium will make a sparkly paint. Next is specific gravity or density. So this is both specific gravity and density are the weight of a material, and specific gravity is comparing the weight of a material to the weight of an equal part of water. So how you would measure this, and I have the golden pigment density chart here, but how I would measure this is if I took this cup and filled it full of, let's say, aquamarine blue or cobalt blue pigment all the way to the brim, and then I filled this with water all the way to the brim and I weighed it. So that's the exact same volume, the exact same measurement of paint, and I weighed them. My blue, for example, I'm going to take a color in here, my ultramarine blue, let's say. My ultramarine blue has a specific gravity of 2.35, which means this cup would weigh 2.35 more than the cup of water because the blue weighs more than the water for the same volume. So something like diarylide yellow is 1.27, so it weighs just barely more than water if I compare it equally. A teaspoon of each. The yellow would weigh 1.27% more. Or 1.27 times more, excuse me. And then if I go to this list for zinc white would weigh way more, 5.6 times what regular water would weigh. Or Mars black would weigh 4.6 times. Or titanium white, which I believe is on this page. Titanium white weighs about 3.9% regular water would. The reason why this is important, because when you put fluids on top of each other, the heavier fluid is going to sink. Now, if I do the same amount of pouring medium and then the same amount of paint, and I do titanium white with one, and let's say I do one of these very light ones, quinacridone red light, and I stack them on top of each other, the titanium white is going to sink below the quinacridone red, and the red is going to bubble up through the white, and that's going to cause cells. Now, I just watched a great video on this by Chase Fluid Art, which I will link in a bubble up above here and in the description below, going over the densities of paints and how to manipulate the density of paint or the specific gravity of paint to create cells. It is the most effective way to do that. The second would be to have an additive like silicone oil, which I have actually used in this painting, because the silicone is so much lighter, it's the same thing. You put paint on top of silicone, the silicone is going to come up through the paint, and as it does, it's going to grab some of the different colors that it comes through and create cells. So specific gravity and density is talking about how much a paint weighs, and when you use paints that weigh different things, you're going to get them to interact with each other. So the next thing I want to talk about together are actually cells and lacing. Traditionally, when you hear someone talk about cells in an acrylic pour, they're talking about something like this, where I get these little round or oblong cells on my pour. And this can be created in a number of different ways, which we're going to talk about in a second here. It can be created by using an additive like alcohol or silicone oil. It can be created by adjusting the weight of the paints that you're using, so the lighter paints come up through the heavier paints and the heavier paints fall through the lighter paints. But those are traditionally what people are talking about cells. Something like this would be a caterpillar cell, where it kind of blobs into each other. It kind of looks like a caterpillar. And then there's smaller cells like this. A pouring medium like Floetrol will create tiny cells like this, or in this case I did a little bit of the reverse dip technique from Fiona. Then there's cells that all mesh together that kind of look like lacing. So normally we'd consider this lacing, but really it's just a ton of cells all mashed together. So cells and lacing are very intertwined. Now you can create cells and lacing by swiping a tool like this over paint, where one paint is heavier than the other, which I've done here with this black and white paint. There is cells and lacing that you can make by doing different techniques. Again, this is the Fiona Art technique, but you can see how there's tons of little cells that it makes it look kind of like a lace. Then there's the Shelley Art Bloom technique that creates tons of little cells. Sometimes they call them lightning cells just because it kind of looks like lightning is going off around. But again, cells and lacing, that can be both called. Then there's other techniques like this was a Dutch pour that creates these little cells on the edges, or this lacing in between. So when we're talking about cells, we're generally talking about these circular or oblong shapes that are coming up inside of an acrylic pour, giving them some additional character. So the next term I want to talk about is cell activator. Now a cell activator, that term I believe was coined by Shelley Art with her Shelley Art Bloom technique. And the reason she called it that is because she put a mixture of paint with a specific color on top of her other colors and blew it out, and that color made cells. Now the reason why that made cells is because that paint is denser than the other paint. And when you have the more dense paint, it's going to fall through and create things like this with an acrylic pour. So if you hear somebody talk about cell activator, they're talking specifically about the technique that Shelley Art uses to create her cells. And they use that in the Bloom technique. Sometimes they do it in the swipe technique, but all of that refers to the Shelley Art technique. If you're referring to anything else, I would prefer, and so would Chase Art if you watched his video, that you just refer to that as a difference in density. You have lighter paints underneath a heavier paint. The lighter paints are going to rise, the heavier paints are going to fall, and that's going to create lacing and cells. Now also with the Shelley Art Bloom technique, she talks about a pillow paint. And the reason she does that is she uses a regular latex paint. Now a latex paint is going to be a little bit puffy compared to if I used regular glue or if I used Liquitex pouring medium. It's a little bit puffy and it kind of floats on air. That's why we call it a pillow for that specific technique. I would only use the name pillow when doing that technique, because the whole idea is when I put a pillow paint down, so I put my regular paint down first, I put my colors on top, I put my cell activator, specific again for this technique, I blow it all out. When I move my paint around, because I have that latex paint underneath, rather than stretch really well the composition, it keeps it whole because the pillow underneath lets the paints move without stretching too much and keeping my composition. Now, A lot of people confuse pillow paint with a base coat or a flow extender, and they are different. Now, a base coat is me putting down a coat of the same paint that I use across my whole painting so that when I put my paint down, it can flow along that paint and that paint remains underneath. A flow extender is slightly different because I don't put it down everywhere. I pour my paint onto the canvas and I put the flow extender around my paint. And then when I'm stretching my paint, my composition will still open up, but I won't lose as much of it because as the paint rolls over the dry canvas, it will consume and roll over the flow extender on the outside. Now, base coat and flow extender, they do kind of the same thing. With a base coat, I think your composition will stretch more. With a flow extender, it won't stretch quite as much, but it's still going to stretch, kind of in between. So for me, base coat is a medium stretch, a flow extender is a small stretch, a pillow is a very small stretch, and none of those, it's going to stretch quite a bit as you tilt paint off of your painting surface. All right, probably one of the hardest ones for people to understand is consistency. Consistency is how much a paint flows when tilted. So a very thick paint will not flow as well as a very thin paint. The thing with acrylic pouring is generally you want all of your colors to be the same consistency so that when you tilt, they all tilt at the same time and you don't get those odd edges because one paint is thinner than the other and is moving quicker when you tilt than the other. Now, a lot of people test the consistency by putting a dollop of paint the same size and then tilting it and see what goes faster. So this paint here would have been thinner than these three paints because they moved about the same speed, but this moved a little bit faster. So I'd add a couple drops to these paints. Another way to test consistency is the drip technique, where you pull up your mixing tool and let it drip in and make sure that the drip is the same for all of the different paints, or that the mound that it creates when the dripped paint touches the paint is the same. So you'll hear mound upon a mound, you'll hear no mound, you'll hear a negative mound. As long as all the paints are doing the same thing, they should be about the same consistency. So the next term is cured or dried paint. They are slightly different. When you pour a liquid onto a surface and it dries, it's going to dry to the touch, so I can touch it and it doesn't feel wet anymore. However, there is still some water or whatever liquidy material is inside. There is still some that won't have evaporated yet. So acrylic pour painting generally dries in 1 to 2 days and cures in 1 to 2 weeks, where you don't have any more evaporation happening after it's cured, or very, very little. I don't recommend that you varnish your paintings until they're fully cured. If they're not fully cured and you put resin on top or you put a varnish on top, it could still evaporate, and that liquid, whether that be water, alcohol, whatever the case may be, will be in between your layers of your paint and your varnish and could potentially cause it to crack or to separate. So dried, generally 24, 48 hours, your painting's going to be dry. Cured is generally that same amount of time, but in weeks. So the next term is technique. Technique refers to how we made the painting. So you heard me refer to this one as the Shelley Art Bloom technique. There's a specific technique to get this look of painting. There is a flip cup where I put all the paint in a cup, I flip it over, let it sit, and then lift the cup up and just let it flow out everywhere. There's a tree wing pour or a straight pour. So I have a straight pour here. Let's just put the paint in the cup and then pour it out. I also did a pearl cell technique. So I combined multiple techniques here. That's why I had the little cells on the outside here. There is the Dutch pour, where I blew out the colors on the sides with a blow dryer, or with your mouth you can also do. So technique just refers to how you created the painting. What you did, the process you used to create the painting in question. So the last thing is the ratio. You hear ratio with acrylic pouring all the time. 1:1, 2:1, 2:1:1. Okay, so we're going to do a little exercise here. So let's say that I want to get 3 ounces of my blue, and I want to do it in a 1:1 ratio. So what I would do is I'd add up all the numbers. So 1, 2. So I have 2 total parts that I want. I have 3 ounces of paint that I want to get, so I would take 3 and divide it by 2, which is going to be equal to 1.5. And then I'd multiply that back into what I want. So this would be, I want 1.5 ounces of pouring medium, and I want 1.5 ounces of paint. Now I can do this for anything. So let's say I also want the 3 ounces of paint, but it's going to be at 2:1. So 2 parts pouring medium, 1 part paint. So I add that up, I get 3. I take my total amount of paint I want to get, divide it by 3, which is equal to 1, and then I multiply it out. So I want 1 times 2 is 2, so I want 2 ounces of paint, or 2 ounces of pouring medium and 1 ounce of paint. Now let's make it a little difficult. Let's say I want to get, I'm going to do a big painting, so I want 7 ounces of paint, and it's going to be 3, my ratio is 3 parts pouring medium to 1 part paint. So I add these up, I get 4. I take my 7, divide it by 4, which is going to give me 1.75 ounces. So then I multiply it back into here. So that means I'd get 5.25 ounces of pouring medium and 1.75 ounces of paint. And again, if I add those up, what does it equal to? 7. So I get my 7 ounces by doing that math there. And that can be used even if we wanted to. So let me change this up a bit. Let's say I will have 2 parts pouring medium, 1 part water, 1 part paint. Let's actually get it on the screen. 2 parts pouring medium, 1 part water, 1 part paint. And I want to get 2.5 ounces total of that color. So I add them up, I get 4. I divide 2.5 by 4. So that's 0.625 ounces. And then I just multiply that in. So I'm going to do 1.25 ounces of pouring medium. I'm going to do 0.625 ounces of water. I'm going to do 0.625 ounces of paint. And if I add all those up, those equal 1.25 also. 1.25 plus 1.25 equals my total 2.5 ounces of paint that I want. And you can do that with any of these measurements. You know, if I have 10 things, 2 parts pouring medium, 0.8 parts GAC 800, 0.2 parts white glue, 1 part of paint, 0.75 parts of water. Again, add those all up, take the total amount that I want, and do that. And you can mathematically come up with how much paint you need.